Okay, it's 9:30. Hey, Evan. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call the Fly Quiet meeting of April 22nd, 2021 to order. Jeanette, please call the roll.
Bensonville.
Here.
City of Chicago 39th Ward.
Here.
Des Plaines. Des Plaines.
I saw him.
He's here.
Doesn't sound like him though.
That actually does sound like him.
Elmhurst.
Here.
Harwood Heights.
Wait, here.
Niles.
Here.
Park Ridge.
Here.
River Grove.
Here.
Schaumburg.
Here.
Schiller Park.
Here.
And Wooddale.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Okay, thank you. May I please have a motion and a second to approve the February meeting minutes?
I'll move so, sir.
Second?
Clark will second.
Okay. Jeanette, you want to call the roll?
Bensonville.
Yes.
City of Chicago 39th Ward.
Yes.
Des Plaines. Elmhurst.
Yes.
Harwood Heights.
Yes.
Niles.
Yes.
Park Ridge.
Yes.
River Grove.
Yes.
Schaumburg.
Yes.
Schiller Park.
Yes.
And Wooddale.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Jeanette. I'd like to start, just to remind everybody that the Fly Quiet Committee was designed to have a fair representation of each quadrant surrounding a lyric field.
Hey Joe, we're getting some feedback. Can we resolve that feedback before we proceed?
Jeanette, can you mute all people that are not chairman?
Doing that right now.
Thank you.
Alderman Chester. Thank you.
Ah. Malcolm, you need to work on your computer there.
He may need to log out and log back in.
Yeah,
we've
it's
had issues with
possible
that
he
as
doesn't
well.
know how it sounds.
Well, Malcolm interrupted me in the middle of my big speech, and now where am I? Okay. Our goal here is to develop a Fly Quiet program in a collaborative effort and present a nighttime runway rotation to the FAA that is good for the entire O'Hare community. The reason why I'm just bringing this up is because I'm beginning to sense in some of us a little parochialism. Please try to avoid that as much as possible. Remember, the reason why we're here is that everybody gets a piece of it. So that means each of us is going to get a piece of the noise. That's, just remember that as we go on. Now I'd like to give an opportunity for the members of ONCC to make a comment before the meeting agenda begins. Anybody?
Yes, Mr. Chair, Frank from 41st Ward in Chicago,
Yes.
ONCC member. I had occasion to request this from the CDA at a previous meeting of the technical committee that they provide start and stop times of the Fly Quiet each night to assist us when we're doing research. For instance, I submitted a couple of screenshots that showed wide body planes taking off and immediately banking to the north. They were at about 12 to 1300 feet altitude at night. But then I found out later that those particular nights at 1 o'clock in the morning, we were not in Fly Quiet mode. So to avoid the waste of time, their time and my time, I asked them to post the start and end times for the Fly Quiet each day. I just wanted to make that part of this meeting so that there's an understanding and we can all expect that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Frank. Anybody else? All right. If there are no other comments, I'd like to call on Ryan to review the interim Fly Quiet report. Ryan?
Good morning, everyone. So we've finalized our report for the entire interim flight quiet runway rotation program. And so today, what I'd like to do is go through it with you briefly. Obviously, all of you are seeing this for the first time, so I just like to go through the contents in summary and then give you an opportunity to review. And if you have any questions regarding the data, or would like to discuss in more detail, we can do that at the next meeting. I just wanted to give everyone the opportunity to review it and spend some time with it, and then we can spend more time, if the committee would like, on the contents of the report or any questions you might have at a upcoming meeting. So with that, we'll go through the report. Again, the interim flight quiet runway rotation program took place between November of 2019 through the end of January, that last week of January 2021 of this year. Page 1 provides some summary and as well as background on the committee, how the program was developed, and some of the highlights of the report. Page 2, we define that flight quiet mode that Mr. Ickes was referring to. And just a reminder, flight quiet mode is not dictated by a specific time rather than a demand situation at the airport. And it is a period of time when each night where the airport is able to operate at least 1 or 2 departure runways and 1 arrival runway, and allows for the use of those preferential flight tracks as we've defined in the flight quiet manual. Now, the majority of night, the airport does operate in a 1 arrival, 1 departure runway configuration, which is how we've been using those configurations for the future flight quiet program. But as you can see for IFQ, we've kind of plotted all of the start and stop times through the entire 48-week program. You can see the start times on purple on top and the stop times on bottom. And so we had an average for that 48-week period of a 10:32 p.m. start and a 6:16 a.m. stop. And again, nighttime as defined, as we define it, and the FAA defines it as 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. So we'd like to, for flight quiet mode to occur as close to 10 p.m. as possible and stop as close to 7 a.m. as possible. You'll see a couple of outliers there in the middle. I'll show you where to find more detail on those, but we did have some significant weather events during the interim flight quiet period that caused the start and stop times to occur very late or early into the morning. Page 2, the graphic on top of, or I'm sorry, page 3, illustrates that demand level and how it really drives the start and stop times of flight quiet mode. The red line, or I'm sorry, yes, the red line is the arrivals, and you'll see how the arrival demand, especially in the morning hours during at the right of the chart, really starts to peak around 7 a.m. And that increase in arrival demand requires the airport to operate more than 1 arrival runway. So it means that the airport comes out of flight quiet mode as we have to open a second or possibly even a third runway to allow for that arrival demand. And then on the left side of the screen, the green line, you'll see that departure demand, where we will have a lot of departure flights coming out at the end of the day, and we may need 2 runways, and the airport may not be able to efficiently use those preferential flight paths as we've defined them. So it's not until that demand drops down to a level where we're able to operate the departure off of 1 or 2 runways and also using that preferential flight paths. The bottom of page 3 has our diagrams for our 6 IFQ runway configurations that this committee outlined to be used in the program. And so we've got configurations H, I, K, L, M, and O. Those were the configurations that were scheduled over the 48-week period. And page 4 shows how those configurations played out as far as utilization. You can see during the entire interim flight quiet, configuration O was by far the best used during the 48-week period, with 75% utilization during flight quiet mode. You can see configuration O is the departures on 28 right and arrivals on 28 center. If we were looking at daytime, that is a common daytime configuration, those arrivals departing on the inboards, as we call them, and arriving on those middle runways. And then we have H, I, M, K, and L. You'll see I in, I guess, call it, for lack of a better term, third place there with 20% utilization. And I, again, is a crosswind configuration with arrivals on 22 right and departures on 22 left. On the bottom of page 4, we have our total utilization of the configurations in IFQ. And for the entire 48-week period, we saw that 47% of the operations that occurred in flight quiet mode operated on the runways as scheduled. You can see the breakout of that other 53%, some of the reasons why the airport wasn't able to adhere to the scheduled runways as they were laid out. Big things were weather. Obviously, IFQ did occur over winter months, something that was different than tests 1, 2, and 3. So we did have some significant weather events that caused the airport to not be able to use the runways as planned. We also had some issues with during COVID-19 impacts, where we had a lot of aircraft grounded or just at least parked on the airfield because they were not being used. And some of those were interfering with navigational aids that caused runways not to be able to be used as they should. And then we also had a big chunk of operational requirements, those being runway safety inspections or aircraft requirements not being able to use the runways that were scheduled to be used. Page 5, we have our runway utilization, where we look at the total arrivals and departures. So this is the little table there on the top left is the total arrivals and departures that occurred during the 48-week period. So we had 27,000, a little over 27,000 operations that occurred in IFQ during flight quiet mode. And on average, you'll see on the right, over 60% of those were arrivals. So kind of a 60-40 split as far as arrivals to departures. On average, we were looking at 82 operations per night in IFQ. Now, during the tests, we really saw that number closer to 100. But of course, we're talking about a period of time in 2020 where the COVID pandemic did have a significant impact on the level of operations, and we had much lower level of operations during IFQ, at least the second half of IFQ, than we saw in the tests. This figure 5 is a tree map here where we show the utilization by runways. The lighter boxes represent west flow and the darker boxes represent east flow. And you can see 28 center was the most used arrival runway in IFQ, while 28 right was the most used departure runway. And coming back, you'll also notice the pattern that we were, those lighter boxes again represent west flow. During IFQ, we were predominantly in west flow conditions, and that is explained by the wind summary here. This wind graphic shows the percent of wind occurrences during IFQ during that entire 48-week period. And as it clearly stands out, we did not have much easterly winds during IFQ, which results all of our east flow configurations may have not been able to be used on some weeks because we had predominant west flow or westerly winds during the IFQ period. And those reports, we have all of the weeks wind roses for each week during IFQ, so you can kind of look at from week to week what the winds were during the entire period. Page 7, we're talking about specifically wide body aircraft and the use of runways. We list out the longest runways here at O'Hare. Of course, 10 left, 28 right, 10 center, 28 center. And we've added 9 center, 27 center for reference. However, of course, important to note that runway opened up in November of last year, but was not used for any nighttime operations during IFQ. So that was not an IFQ runway, or was it used as a alternate long runway during IFQ. But you can see at the bottom of the page, the number of wide bodies that were able to use runways less than 10,000 feet was about 10%. So 10% of the wide bodies, as we define them, were able to operate on the crosswind runways or 9 right, 27 left, which all 3 of those are less than 10,000 feet. And then page 8, we've got kind of the overall summary chart that you're all familiar with, again, summarizing all of the highlights for the interim flight quiet 48-week period from November 3rd, 2019 through January 31st, 2021. The average start and stop time, 47% of operations were able to utilize the designated runways as planned. Average operations per night were 82, and average time in flight quiet mode was 7 hours and 44 minutes. And of course, we have a number of reasons why we weren't in that kind of gray area, able to fill up the box, if you will, with the full utilization of all designated runways. We had several things that occurred during IFQ that prevented that from happening. Page 9 starts our nightly interim flight quiet logs. And so this is something that Mr. Ifq was referring to, where we delineate the start and stop times of every night for flight quiet mode, the duration, the percentage of nighttime, and what percentage of operations were able to utilize the designated runways. And we did this for every single night of the 48-week period for IFQ. There were a couple of nights that we were not either able to go into flight quiet mode, or we did not have the radar data available to delineate the start and stop times, and those are footnoted. I believe on December 30th, 2019, we had a very significant snowstorm event that prohibited the airport from ever actually going into flight quiet mode. And then we had a few days in early 2020 where the radar data that the Department of Aviation's noise management system is supplied with had an interruption in the data feed, and we weren't able to verify the flight operations on those nights. But the rest of the nights, we have start and stop times for each night throughout the 48-week period. Starting on page 16 is that week-to-week windrow summary, so you can go through and see what the winds were occurring on each week of IFQ. Throughout the 48-week period. Page 20 is our runways report for the entire IFQ period for flight quiet mode. So you'll see the utilization of runway percentages, as well as the average nightly departures and arrivals. You can see again, 28 right and 28 center were our primary runways for departures and arrivals, at least as far as utilization. And then the rest of the operations were able to be spread out. You can see on departures 4 left and 2 left, 3 and 11% respectively. And then on the arrivals, 22 right and 4 right, 11% and 5% respectively. But again, 28 center and 27 left did carry most of the load in west flow. And again, the airport was operating predominantly in west flow during IFQ, as shown by that wind diagram. Page 21 is the airline summary report, page 21 and 22, where we list out all of the airlines that operated in flight quiet mode during IFQ, the number of departures and arrivals for each airline, whether they're a dedicated passenger or cargo operator. So we are looking at a total of 97 individual air carriers that operated during flight quiet mode during IFQ, with a total of 27,228 operations. Page 23 is our fleet mix report for flight quiet mode during IFQ. You can see again that average 82 operations per day during IFQ. A couple things to point out. You'll see wide body aircraft represented almost 40% of the operations in flight quiet mode. Narrow body was 47.8%, and regional aircraft just 11.7%. So although during the day we see that regional aircraft percentage be much higher and usually closer to 50% of the fleet mix, but at night you'll see the narrow body and wide body aircraft are the aircraft types most predominantly used during the overnight hours, at least during IFQ. And that is the report for the interim flight quiet runway rotation program. As I mentioned, we want you to take a look at this report and the data, and then let us know if you have any questions. And if you do have specific questions, maybe submit those through Jeanette before the next meeting, and we can prepare answers and responses if needed.
All right, thank you, Ryan. We have a couple questions here. Ernie, you're first. Ernie?
If I put my hand up, Joe, I didn't mean to. I apologize.
Oh, okay then. Peter?
Oh, yeah, Ryan. Can we go back to page 4 on the presentation there? You've got the reasons for not using the designated runways, the operational requirements was 27%. And that kind of lumps together safety inspections and aircraft requirements. Does that number include runway requests, specifically runway? Can we break that down further as to what % of that is maintenance versus runway requests? Is that possible?
Yeah, we can look at that and see if we can carve out specific long runway requests versus maintenance or other requirements.
Yeah, I'd like to see that. Thanks.
Right. Evan?
All right, my question goes back to the win summary. And, I've back when we used to do we were an ad hoc committee before we were ever the flight quiet committee, we used to talk a lot, so this was back in 2016, we used to talk a lot about, we know aircraft like taking off and landing into a headwind, but what we accepted back in 2016 is that aircraft could accept a 5-knot tailwind, and there was also a crosswind thing. But why don't we talk about the 5-knot tailwind anymore? Because I think what I'm getting at is I think what we could do is we could stay in primary configurations more if we accepted that tailwind, but it seems that we haven't accepted that tailwind in a while, because in rotation test 1, 2, and 3, we had a provision in there for a 5-knot tailwind.
Yeah, what I will say, and I don't know the answer to this right now, is I don't know if IFQ didn't adhere to that 5-knot tailwind. It could be that we had winds predominantly out of the west that exceeded 5 knots, but that's something we can look at from week to week and see, if the knots were either variable or under 5 knots, but still operated in a west flow configuration. See if those stand out quite a bit more than we saw in the tests, and maybe something that we can look at moving forward as discussing with air traffic or making sure that that 5-knot tailwind is something that's still the airport's allowed to operate in either condition.
Okay, yeah, I'd like to dig into that more. Anecdotally, I'm just clicking around, and it seems that when the wind switches, they're switching into a different flow. And if we can get back to that 5-knot, I think it's an important thing that we can stay in a primary configuration longer. We know at nighttime, historically, wind speeds drop. And so that allows for more predictability. And I
Yeah.
just want to bring that back up, and I don't know, it fell off the wayside, but I think it's an important concept that we're going to need to look at and carry forward.
I agree. And I think, especially as we get closer to formalizing a program, that would be something to really, I think, be beneficial in including in, kind of ONCC's purview of tracking adherence, something to keep track of.
And I think it lends more credence to, or more predictability. And that's one of the huge things we're always trying to do is predictability. So we can stay in that primary configuration longer. I would just like to bring that back in the conversation and bracket back into the fold. That concludes my comment.
All right, Dan has a comment.
Yeah, I'll be quick. Just to reiterate what Evan said, we do think wind is a critical factor in determining this program, in that we should continue to reference not only this report, but try and tie it into our assumptions and recommendations on the final flight quiet. Thanks.
Okay, Ron?
You're muted. Ron, you're muted. Ron, you're muted.
You got 5 seconds, Ron, to turn it on. All right, Ron, we'll get back to you. All right. Any other questions? All right, if there's no more questions, we will just continue.
Okay, Mr. Chair, we're moving on to item
Number
6.
6, review of alternatives B and H, requested modifications. This is all the modifications that were requested by us.
Yeah, so I'd like to start off first with, touching base on where we're at with the process in case there's anybody attending for the first time today. Again, the Flight Quiet 21 process involves a lot of development and review. We've been developing and approving alternatives for some time now. And we do have 2 alternatives that have been moved forward for further consideration. So we're currently in the review and revise alternative point of the process. Once the committee gets to a point of consensus as to a alternative that they think would work best, that would be moved forward for recommendation to the full commission, the full ONCC commission. The full ONCC commission would vote to approve that. The CDA would then package that into a proposal for the FAA to do a full review, not only environmental, but also air traffic, making sure that it meets standards, as well as identify any impacts that there may be with this new program. And then once approved, the ONCC would really take the mantle as far as working on outreach along with partnerships with the CDA and FAA in implementing the new program and getting everybody, all the stakeholders on board, and also tracking adherence. This is another graphic just kind of outlining where we've been to date. The committee's established their mission statement and objectives and guiding principles that we've used to develop these alternatives. We've had developed specific 8 criteria that we've used as a guideline to develop the alternatives. We looked at the possibility, including RNAV departures. Some of the alternatives that were considered did include RNAV departures. The committee opted to move forward with 2 alternatives that did not include RNAV. And we are looking at alternatives B and H right now. B and H were a culmination of input that we received from all the committee members as far as what they'd like to see in an alternative. Some of the major components and processes that the committee seems to be in favor of. And since we've moved those forward, we've met with most of the committee members and gotten a lot of really good feedback and some of their thoughts on how these alternatives can be improved. So what we're going to do today is go through first the requested modifications that we received. Now, we met and talked quite a bit with most of you and had really good discussions on these alternatives, answered questions, and gotten any specific feedback. We did receive a lot of feedback regarding these alternatives, but we're going to focus today just on any specific changes that we heard would like to be made. So although we did get some thoughts about overall the alternatives, maybe how, moving forward, some of the aspects that might be refined or developed further, but we're going to stick to just specific changes that we were asked to consider for, or at least for the committee to consider for specifically components of alternatives B and H.
All right, Ryan, Cynthia has a quick question.
Okay.
We can't hear you, Cynthia. Can't hear you.
Well, I'm going to keep going, and if Cynthia is
Yeah,
able
keep
to.
talking. Maybe she'll, when you're
yeah.
finished, she'll be able to talk to us.
So with this slide here, alternative B, and I know this is a pretty busy slide. There's a lot of colors going on here, but there is a bit of method to this, and I want to talk through it slowly so everybody understands what they're looking at. So you've seen this table before when we're summarizing alternative B and H. Again, on the left-hand side, we have our major components of alternative B. It is a 12-week rotation consisting of 6 specific configurations. Those 6 specific configurations each have a letter identifier, as well as in this table, a color identifier. So each configuration has a specific color. You'll see configuration Q has kind of that off orange color to it. The alternative incorporates the split north-south airfield concept, where the idea is not only do we switch from east to west flow from week to week, we also switch from north airfield to south airfield to crosswind from week to week. This alternative considers vector headings only, so no RNAV considered in this alternative. And those vector headings, those departure headings for each departure runway, we have not 1, but 2 departure headings for each runway. And those are labeled with, you'll see under the heading column 1 or 2, depending on the schedule. So again, those 6 configurations, they are rotated for the first period with using heading 1, and then rotated on the second period using heading 2. The schedule has 8 east-west weeks and 4 crosswind weeks. So now going back to our table, hopefully you get a little bit better idea of the coloring. And so what we've done here is kept the same order as far as configurations, how they were scheduled as originally presented. We've kept the same headings as originally presented, along with the arrival pairing runway and the identified long runway if needed. So what you see in red here is specific changes that we were asked to consider, or the committee to consider. And so if we're looking at configurations column, I'm sorry, we can make sure everyone's muted and please put your hand up if you have questions. I believe that's Ron Zagwa, if we can mute him, thank you.
Come on, everybody.
So the configuration column, we have the original configurations as scheduled for alternative B, and pretty much across the board, everyone we talked to has asked to consider swapping configurations P and O in weeks 4 and 5 and 10 and 11 to help better distribute and avoid consecutive impacts. And so you'll see here in red, we've got in week 4, instead of configuration P, the recommendation is configuration O. And week 5, instead of configuration O, it is recommended that we consider configuration P. And then again, in weeks 10 and 11, the same swap. And then the other comments that we received on the alternative were specific to runway headings. And so on the runway heading column, we have all the original runway headings as identified in the original alternative that was moved forward. And then in red, we have all of the runway headings that we have been asked for the committee to consider changing those to. So for week 1, one of the comments we got was a 27 left runway heading, departure heading. Originally, it was identified at a 280 degree heading for heading 1, and then for heading 2, a 295 degree heading. You'll see that come up on week 7. The first comment we got was a possible looking at instead of doing a 280 degree heading, if there's a heading that might better follow the 390 corridor on the west end of the airport. And for runway 27 left, that a runway heading departure or heading 270 would most align with that roadway and keep it over that roadway for the longest period of time. So that is the consideration for configuration Q in weeks 1 and 7. There was also in week 7, you'll see someone else had recommended instead of a 295 degree heading to keep it at 290 degree headings rather than a full 25 degree offset off the runway center line to do a 290 degree heading. In week 3, this is a crosswind configuration, configuration L, where we are departing runway 4 left and arriving runway 4 right. The comment we received, that original heading 039 degrees is pretty much a runway heading, so straight off departure. And the comments, and this, we did receive several comments back that it would be preferred if the departure heading did not overlap a subsequent arrival heading. So if we're arriving the reciprocal to that 22 right, the request was that the heading be something different than the runway heading to avoid overlapping impacts. So the recommendation was to change the 039 degree heading to a 015 degree heading, which would offset that. So it would not overlap the arrival corridor as much as a runway heading departure. Week 7, we discussed those heading changes. Week 8, configuration M, where we are departing 4 left and arriving 10 center. The request was instead of a 115 degree heading for the second departure heading to change that to a 110 degree heading. Week 9, back to configuration L. So this would be the second departure vector heading. Originally, it was a 14 degree heading. The recommendation was that we change that to a due north 360 degree departure heading so as to try and stay on the Interstate 294 or perhaps the river and forest preserve corridor that is more compatible land use on that northwest side of the airport. Sorry, northeast side of the airport. Week 10, again, we talked about the configuration change, but we're still looking at configuration P when we're departing 9 right and arriving 9 center. The original departure heading was 065 degrees. The recommendation was to change that to 070 degrees. For week 11, for configuration O, the original departure heading where we're departing runway 28 right in West Flow and arriving 28 center The recommendation was for a 250-degree heading instead of 245. And for week 12, we have the crosswind configuration I, where we have departing runway 22 left. This original heading was another runway heading departure, so straight out departure at 222 degrees. Again, the same comment to try and avoid overlapping the same arrival corridor or path. And so the recommendation was to adjust that to a 195-degree, a more southerly turn off runway heading for runway 22 left. Now, we also received a lot of comments about the long runways and providing specific departure vector headings for identified long runways for each configuration, which the committee may want to consider. However, at this time, we think it's more beneficial that we identify first and get a really good sense of what the configuration order of configurations are, as well as the primary departure headings for those configurations before we start adding in long runway headings. Because really, if we don't have those figured out, those long runway headings are going to have to be constantly changed to accommodate any order switches or departure heading switches that we do with the primary consideration. So that's something that we'll look at a later date once we have a more refined configuration order, as well as more refined headings for those primary configurations. Now, for these modifications for the runway headings, for right now, we're using, just these boxes and numbers. In the past, we've done a lot of different things. We've done boxes and arrows and those LMAX contours, various other graphical representations of these departure headings. We've done the purple arrows over population density maps. At this point, we're really, happy to entertain whatever, the committee thinks is most beneficial as far as graphically representing these departure headings, so that you can deliberate and make better decisions. So for now, we're just leaving at these basically just the simple boxes with the degree headings. If between now and the next meeting you'd like to see something different, or you think there'd be something more helpful, we're happy to entertain that. So those are the specific requested for modifications for alternative B. Do we have any questions at this time before I move on to the modifications requested for alternative H?
I don't hear any. I don't see any.
Hopefully that's a good sign that I was able to explain it in a way that everyone understood, or I didn't, and that's why there are no questions. But again, if you're having trouble following along, please feel free to ask for clarification. So
Hey, Ryan, can I just give some feedback? I'm going to need to personally visualize those heading changes. I can't see, doesn't make sense to me just on a
I
graph.
think
We're gonna
arrow's a good idea on a map.
Yeah.
yeah, so we're happy to do those. I think the last time we showed the pink arrows on the population density and those quadrants. If you guys think that's, at this point, the most useful for you to help kind of visualize these, we're happy to recreate those and show how these new headings compare to the original.
Yes, and you did arrows before, and that's great. But if these arrows, if you put in, could be close to the degree of the change, that would be helpful. As close as possible.
Yes, Mayor, we're happy to do that.
Thank you.
We're just making sure we don't want to be creating a lot of material that really isn't useful for this committee. And so yeah, we're glad to hear that those, might be helpful, and we're happy to recreate those for the committee.
Okay, Ryan, we're starting to get questions. Do you want to take us? You want to stop and listen to the questions before we go on, or do you want to?
Yeah, I want to make sure that everybody. I don't want to get too far along, and I'm losing people as far as what these modifications are. So let's go ahead and try and entertain some questions here.
All right, Dan, you're first.
Yeah, in addition to showing those departure headings, we would just ask that you still overlay the arrival corridors. We sort of fear we're forgetting about the arrivals and that some of these recommendations to change headings overlap arrival corridors, which, as we know from prior data, is 2/3 of the operations. So if there's an arrow for departures, just please show the arrival corridor as well. Thanks.
Okay.
Okay, all right, Dan. Ernie, you're next.
Thank you, Joe. Ryan, I just want to make sure I understand. What we see now in alternative B, and I'll go to weeks 3 and 4. P and O was just swapped with O and P. Do I understand that correctly? And that's true for 10 and 11 too, right? Weeks?
That is the, yes, that is the recommended or requested modification. I have not actually done that, so I want the committee to entertain that and discuss, if that's what we want to do. But yes, that it was the request to just swap P and O, change the iteration there in weeks 4 and 5 and 10 and 11.
All right, so 4 and 5 originally was O and P and now it's P and O, or is it the other way around? I just want to make sure I'm not confused.
Yeah, it's the other way around. So originally it was week 4 configuration P. The request is that instead of week 4 configuration P, we do week 4 configuration O. Week 5 was originally configuration O. The request is instead of O, we do P.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
All right, Ron?
Yeah, can you hear me this time?
Yes.
Okay, good. The graphic representation that Evan requested, is there any way that, Ryan, you guys can do that sooner rather than later so that committee members can have a chance to look it all over before the next meeting happens?
Potentially, yes. We will try to distribute those prior to the next meeting.
Okay. All right, very good. That's really important. Thanks, Ron.
Chairman, we have a question from Alderman Dunn.
Oh, okay. Bob?
Thanks, Ryan. I think you did a good job of incorporating the comments from the committee, slightly tweaking the configurations in alternative B, and making some small modifications to the heading to the positive. So this is the primary primary configuration plan, and I like your approach of locking in the configuration and the headings and tabling the long runway to a subsequent analysis. I think that's a good approach. Does the secondary configurations just fall in line with what you have as the primary? Is there any tweaking or adjustment needed?
Yeah, so good question. We're actually going to be, once we get through the modifications, we're going to be talking through those secondary configurations on the next item on the agenda. So we'll go through, we have kind of updated graphics for the committee that incorporate the secondary configurations. However, these secondary configurations, and we'll get to that, are still kind of scheduled or paired as the original alternatives as they were scheduled, so they don't incorporate any of these requested modifications. So we haven't made any changes yet, as we still need the committee to kind of discuss the changes and take a look and see how they might play out when we consider those secondary configuration pairings. So yes, we'll be talking about secondary configurations and how they fit in.
Great, thanks.
Okay. Ryan?
Okay, good. So we're going to move on to alternative H, and similar representation of the requested modifications. Again, re-summarizing alternative H, it is a 16-week rotation versus alternative B, which was a 12-week rotation. It's the same 6 configurations. just rotated over 16 weeks as the crosswind weeks are doubled to 8 instead of 4. We have a north, again, the same concept of the north-south airfield split where it alternates between north-south airfields and utilizing the crosswinds. Same concept as far as vector headings. The only difference between B and H as far as vector headings is that alternative H only utilized, at least in the initial alternative, only utilizes 2 headings for the crosswind configurations. All of the east-west configurations incorporate a single departure vector heading. And again, 8 east-west weeks in the schedule paired with 8 crosswind weeks. So you'll see the weeks, again, weeks 1 through 16, the original configurations assigned to each week. And in this case, we received some significant requests for changes to this alternative, pretty much a reshuffling of the entire schedule. You can see outlined there as each week, except for weeks 2, 6, 10, and 14, have requested that we use different configurations. As originally scheduled, you can see that the original configurations, the crosswinds, were scheduled back to back. So we had a rotation of a south airfield, north airfield, crosswind, crosswind, and that kind of pattern played out over 16 weeks. In this requested modification, you'll see that the crosswinds are kind of reordered and no longer appear back to back. And so it goes a crosswind, east-west, crosswind, east-west, crosswind pattern. So those are the configurations recommended for all 16 weeks. And then the other changes that we had recommended were to the headings, specific headings. So for week 8, configuration L, which is a crosswind configuration where we're departing runway 4 left and arriving runway 4 right. As originally assigned in 4 left for the departure heading, this was a second vector heading. So in weeks, for configuration L in week 1, we had a 049 degree heading. And then in week 2, we had a 029 degree heading. And those 2 headings get repeated again in weeks 12 and week 16. The request is for this particular alternative is to, instead of having 49 degrees in the first iteration and 29 degrees in the second iteration, is for configuration L to repeat the 49 degree heading in the first 8 weeks. So in weeks 4, it would be 49 degree headings. In week 8, it would be 49 degree heading. And then week 12, again, instead of the 49 degree heading, and then in week 16, the 29 degree heading, it would be the 29 degree heading repeated again in week 16. For configuration M in week 9, you'll see originally the vector heading was 100 degrees. The request was to change that to 110 degrees. For week 10, configuration Q, the original vector heading was 280 degrees for runway 27 left. That had been changed or requested to be a 290 degree heading. In week 13, configuration O, this one incorporated a second vector heading. So originally, configuration O had a single vector heading in week 5 at 260 degrees. And then in week 13, the recommendation was to do a secondary heading at 250 degrees. And then week 14, configuration P, where we're departing 9 right to the east. Originally, it was the vector heading was assigned 080 degrees. The recommendation was to change that to 070 degrees. And so those are the requested modifications, mainly due to the reordering or reshuffling, if you will, of the configurations, as well as specific changes to vector headings.
Okay,
So again, the, the big, I guess, there are no changes to, there are no new configurations requested to be put into this alternative. It's just the same configurations reshuffled, if you will, over that 16-week schedule.
okay. Thanks, Ryan. Karen has a question.
Yeah, Ryan, for this one with the extensive reshuffling of the configurations, can we see an updated exhibit? I have some concerns that we're still going to end up with consecutive impacts with the long runways. But I'm making my head hurt a little bit trying to visualize the reshuffling. So I think if we could see that visually, that would be helpful.
Absolutely, yeah. And we'll try and pair that with the visuals for the departure headings and get that out between now and the next committee meeting.
Okay, Evan?
Yeah, I'm just gonna second what Karen said. I'm not a smart man. I don't have the configurations committed to memory, so I'm just gonna need to see it laid out again.
I gotta tell you, this stuff after sitting here for an hour already is beginning to turn into a blur. I need time. I need time, and I need as many graphic representations as we can find for this stuff.
Yeah, and I guess originally, when we were trying to, think about how best to present this, we didn't want to completely overwhelm and have a bunch of different, exhibits with a bunch of different patterns in there representing all the, reshuffling. So, I guess the thought was not to overwhelm everyone too much. And as you can see, it's already pretty overwhelming with just trying to visualize the changes. So we'll help with some better graphics so that, you can kind of see what it all looks like on paper.
All right, Karen again.
Sorry, first, Ryan, I do think this was a great way to present it. This was really an easy way to digest it. I think so. The next step is definitely the visual piece. And I think the other piece is just in regards to H for the next meeting, my request is for those communities who are on the crosswind runway departure and arrival headings. I would really like to hear your thoughts on the two departure headings. I have concerns about a 16-week configuration, and that's largely being driven by the dual departure headings in alternative H. And so I would just be interested to hear if that's something you all prefer, or if you would be okay with H having all single departure headings.
Okay. Evan?
Just for the next meeting and how to visualize this stuff, personally, just my personal feedback, I'm very comfortable with the stick map schedules. We've been looking at those for half of a decade at this point. So if we could just see how those lay out, that really helps with the configurations for me.
All right. Okay. Any other questions? If not, Ryan, continue.
Yeah, I just want to,
We got one, Bob?
Yeah, just want to follow up to what Karen had mentioned. I think from a crosswind runway standpoint, when you try to do the two departures, you tend to overlap the arrival path. So it does make a little more sense, in our opinion, to just only have one departure path and try to take advantage of the compatible use in doing that.
Okay, Cynthia.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. I apologize for the previous problem. So Ryan, are we no longer forwarding two alternatives to the FAA? I thought for the longest time we were looking to provide two alternatives for the FAA evaluation. And when you presented this data, you mentioned that you were just going to forward one.
Well, I said the CDA would submit a proposal, and that proposal would include all of the work this committee has done over the years, as well as how these alternatives were developed, decided upon, and one of them would be a preferred alternative. Ideally, you would have, because we've looked at so many different alternatives. The preferred alternative would be a single alternative proposed, but there would be a secondary alternative that may not have been the preferred alternative, but still meets the criteria that was established for the committee.
Okay, so that was my understanding, that we have pretty much arrived at B and H as the two preferred alternatives, and that this period of iteration of tweaking them and improving them was aimed at putting the best two options forward.
Well,
I
I
just wanna make sure
prefer
that-
to, yeah, I prefer to look at it
Yeah.
as, you know, the Fly Quiet Committee as well as the ONCC committee developing
Sure.
what their preferred program is, you know, basically what is the new Fly Quiet 21 program to be. The tweaking that we're doing here could potentially lead to another alternative. We could have alternatives B, you know, as Aaron mentioned in the past, alternatives B, 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, depending on what is decided about these modifications. For instance, alternative H here with these reshuffling, you know, if the committee wants to move forward at looking at alternative H as recommended that we reshuffle, that would become an alternative H, you know, 0.2, let's say. So there could potentially be a number of iterations of both alternatives B and H, but the overall goal, and the goal has always been to develop a new Fly Quiet program for the new airfield, not two. So really it's the, you know, which alternative of these two makes the most sense to move forward with next. And out of these two, you know, we may have further iterations based on any changes or tweaking we do.
Okay.
All right, next we have Dan and then Mayor Gisarni.
Yes, the single heading concept that Karen mentioned for alternative H, we think that should also be considered for alternative B. And it's not necessarily just cutting the rotation in half, but picking the heading that least overlaps the arrival corridors for consideration. It's sort of built into what's illustrated here, but you can't necessarily assume it's a consecutive order, if that makes sense. Thanks.
Okay, Mayor?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Due to the reshuffling of this, if I follow along, I'm still concerned, as Karen is, about the consecutive impacts. It looks as to me that the designated long runways are duplicated every 2 weeks. So that's something maybe we can take a look at.
Yeah, Mayor, I think the subsequent graphics that we can do to show all the specific changes here would help illustrate that for you.
Exactly. Thank you.
All right, if there's any more questions, Ryan, you can continue.
Thank you. So now, yeah, we still have item 7 to go through here, which is the review of the primary configurations with their secondary configuration pairings. And so I do want to spend a little time talking through this. So we developed basically those same graphics that you're used to with some slight modifications to them. So I want to talk through what those are so everyone understands what they're looking at. So we're looking at alternative B. We're going to start with the runway rotation schedule for weeks 1 through 6. Again, this is alternative B is a 12-week schedule. So this is the first half. And so for week 1, you'll see on the top row will be our primary configuration. And on the bottom row is the secondary configuration pairing. So for those that may be listening for the first time or maybe not familiar what we're referring to, the primary configuration is the preferred configuration to be used in that week. However, if the winds are not favorable, as we were talking before, if the winds are out of the east that week and over 5 knots, the airport will have to use an east flow configuration. And so the alternative is that secondary east flow configuration. So we're looking at in week 1, the primary configuration is configuration Q, where we're arriving 27 center and departing 27 left. Now we've added a little bit of some numbers here to these graphics. and I want to explain those. So in alternative B, as you recall, we have two vector headings for each departure runway in the schedule. And so configuration Q, we've added a -1 representing the first departure heading to be used in the schedule. And so that represents VH vector heading 280 degrees. Now these, again, all these configurations, all the order of the configurations, as well as the departure headings, are the original alternative B schedule and departure headings. They do not, these graphics at this time do not reflect the requested modifications. That's something we can do subsequently and distribute to the committee to help visualize the changes better. But I just wanted to make sure everyone understood these kind of little box configuration graphics, what they're looking at. And so week 2, we have configuration M with the first vector heading at 100 degrees. And then that's paired with configuration O, you'll see in the second secondary row, and that's a -1 as well. I also want to note that the vector headings for the secondaries, we're also using that first vector heading. So we're basically using vector heading 1 in the first 6 weeks and then vector heading 2 in the second 6 weeks. Week 3 is primary configuration L, crosswind configuration, departing 4 left and arriving 4 right. The reciprocal to that, or the secondary, is the configuration I, arriving 22 right and departing 22 left. You'll see on the bottom row. Week 4 is configuration P, east flow configuration. The reciprocal to that is configuration Q, where we're arriving 27 center and departing 27 left. Week 5 is configuration O, west flow configuration paired with the secondary configuration M. And again, that has the single, I'm sorry, not the single, but the first iteration of the vector heading. In configuration O, that's 260 degrees, and configuration M, that's 100 degrees. And then in week 6, we go back to the crosswind configurations, this time I, the primary, and then paired with L, the secondary. And of course, all of these highlight the designated long runway for each configuration so that you can see the iterations there and how you may also have, depending on the need for that designated long runway, operations that may overlap each other. And so this is where a lot of comments we got swapping that weeks 4 and 5 to help alleviate some of that consecutive impacts. Now this is the back end of the schedule, weeks 7 through 12. And again, the same process where we're pairing the primary and secondary, but you'll note we have a Q-2 and a P-2, meaning we are now using that secondary vector heading. So the same configurations we used in weeks 1 through 6. However, this time the departure is using a different vector heading. In this case, Q is using the 295 degree heading and P is using the 065 degree heading. And then as we move forward through the schedule, primary M paired with secondary O configuration. So east flow and then west flow paired with a west flow configuration, crosswind L configuration, departing 4 left and arriving 4 right. The secondary configuration would be I paired with 2-2 right arrivals and departing 2-2 left. Week 10, back to east-west runways, configuration P. The secondary reciprocal would be configuration Q. Week 11, configuration O. Secondary configuration would be M, the reciprocal. And then back to the crosswinds, I this time. And then if we need to use east flow, it would be L. Again, the back half is using that second vector heading, as well as you can see the designated long runaways. And again, weeks 10 and 11, the recommendation across the board was to swap those configurations to help better distribute the east flow, west flow, the north to south, as well as the long runaway distribution in the schedule. So that is the graphics, I guess, we would use to depict at this time for the primary and secondary configurations, as well as identifying those vector headings from week to week. And this is something I think we would use this to recreate the modified alternatives so that the committee can use this graphic to see how those vector headings paired with the long runways, as well as the configuration reshuffling, how that looks from week to week.
All right, Evan, do you have a question?
Yeah, why are we designating a long runway in parallel configurations? What's the need for that?
Really, there isn't, but it's just kind of, I guess, more so pointing out the fact that there isn't a need for a long runway because it's already using a long runway. So to your point, and maybe it's a moot point not to show it, but I guess the thought was we don't need to designate a third runway because the long runway is already included in the configuration.
I mean, I'm not going to die on this hill, but I think the innovation was creating a designated long runway for crosswind configurations. I don't think it was ever necessary for a parallel configuration, but if we want to show it that way, I'm not going to object.
Okay. There's no other questions, so Ryan, you can continue.
Okay. So then we have the same process for alternative H with the same idea. The only difference here is, remember, alternative H only had 2 departure headings for the crosswind configurations as originally scheduled and approved. So any changes to adding secondary headings or reshuffling isn't incorporated into this graphic, but it's the same idea where we show the week to week primary paired with the secondary configurations on the bottom half of the screen. This is, again, a 16-week schedule, so we're looking at weeks 1 through 6. You can see that the vector headings on the top row here, really the only crosswind configurations I and L have that secondary departure heading. So for weeks 1 through 6, we're using the first vector headings, the 232 degrees for 22 left and the 49 degree for 4 left. As we proceed weeks 7 through 12, you'll see those crosswind runways come up again, and we're using the second vector heading. So those are labeled accordingly with the -2. And again, as originally scheduled, you'll see the crosswinds back to back and then parallel or east-west, east-west, north-south, crosswind, crosswind. And then we have our last slide where we complete the 16 weeks with the remaining 4 configurations paired with their secondary. And you can see, again, the ending with those crosswind runways back to back in the schedule, utilizing the second vector heading for the departure runways. So that are the graphics illustrating the primary configurations and alternatives B and H as originally scheduled, along with their paired secondary configurations that we would use in the event of wind conditions dictating that secondary east flow or west flow.
All right. Looks like we have a couple questions. Jacob Hill. Oh, no, wait, I'm sorry. Not yet, not yet. You're not. Any questions from the committee? No? All right. We got quite a bit of information here that we're going to have to deal with. Our next ONCC Fly Quiet meeting is May 27th, 2021. It'll be a Zoom conference starting at 9:30. I'd like to make just a quick statement before we move on. We're coming to the end of the road here. In the coming months, we're going to have to make our final decisions and move on. There's 2 things that concerns me now at this point. The first one we discussed a little bit is parochialism. Please, please try to look at the totality of what we're doing here and recognize that all of us are going to get a piece of noise. All right. The second thing I'm worried about are rumors. Now, how do I define a rumor? I define a rumor as any statement that somebody makes that's outside of what we've already learned as a fact. Okay, that's a rumor. Now, when you hear a rumor, this is what I want you to do. I want you to ask what facts support what you're being told. What the statement is. What facts does that person have in order to make the statement that they're making? Okay? If they can't do that, that makes the statement unsubstantiated. And I ask you to ignore it. If they come up with facts, a list of facts that you find are pertinent, that make sense, and help support their statement, I want you to bring it forward. Okay? Send it to Jeanette first, so we take a look at what it is. If they're not substantiated with facts, don't continue saying them. Don't perpetuate it. At this point, it is counterproductive. Any questions over that? All right, now with that, comments from the audience. We have a couple.
Joe, I have, Dan has his hand raised, and so does Cynthia and Frank Igus.
Oh, okay, so let's do Dan, let's do Cynthia, and Karen too has got a question.
Oh, Ron Seymour.
Oh, Ron. Okay. Those three, and
Thank you, Joe. Just following up what we're doing for the next meeting, are we still accepting recommendations on what was presented today? We had made some recommendations specific to secondary configurations, and I'm wondering how we get those into the discussion.
that's a good question.
Well, it's, I guess, up to, Joe and Karen, but in my mind, yeah, we would continue to tweak as needed. However, at this point, we were only really discussing specific requested modifications to the components of alternative B and H as presented thus far. But as we continue the discussion, I'm sure there'll be, many further refinements as we go, and those would always be discussed, and the committee can deliberate the merits of each change.
Okay, because we did express that as a modification to B is the secondary configuration. So that's why I was surprised it wasn't part of
the committee hasn't seen the secondary configurations paired with the primaries yet.
Okay.
So we thought
So
it was
for next
premature to start making changes or discuss changes to it until the committee's kind of seen what it looks like as originally scheduled, and then from here, yes, we can tweak those secondaries if needed.
Okay, I understand. Thank you, Ryan.
Oh, Ron?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to towards the beginning when I was muted, trying to make a comment when Evan was talking about the 5-knot tailwind. Ryan, when you look at the information, can you also look at the time that we were not in fly quiet because there was a lot of construction going on, especially over the past year or two? And I remember from discussions before that during the summer and nighttime is when winds are typically more calm. I think I could be wrong on that, which would mean that there'd be more potentially east flow because you could flip the airport as you wanted. So when you look into that, can you just provide some information on that? That might explain why there was such a small percentage of east flow this time.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, we'll try to contextualize it as best we can with all the other variables that were happening at the airport that may have affected that outcome.
Mayor Giserni, you have a question? No. Okay.
Cynthia and then Frank Igus.
Okay, Cynthia and Frank and Michael.
Okay, thanks, Joe. I just want to recognize how impressed I am with the IFQ program and the performance of everybody in making it perform. The 7 hours and 44 minutes average time in fly quiet, I think, may exceed, and I'm doing this from memory, the previous performance by almost an hour. And the number of ops per night at 82 with the pandemic with the construction, with all of the challenges that we knew were present in IFQ. Everybody really obviously worked hard to implement the RRP, and that includes the ops department at CDA, the tower, this committee, Aaron's group, Brian's group. You know, we knew going into that it was kind of a really difficult effort, and the performance needs to be commended. And I think it also just represents the opportunity going forward. And so I just want to give everybody an attaboy, and the future, you know, is bright to continue and improve upon this when we get a premium alternative to go forward with.
Okay, thank you, Cynthia. Frank, did you have something to say?
Yes, Mr. Chair. I would just like to make a statement to the obvious, but today's presentation by Ryan especially showed the number of variables affecting the usage of the runways throughout the day, but specifically during the fly quiet times of 11 to 7, and what effects the airlines present us at arriving at the real fly quiet time. Airline demand, the operations needs of the airport, the changing wind direction and weather lead to, according to Ryan, a 43% adherence to the plan, we'll call it, the fly quiet plan. When it comes down to it, the pilots make the decisions, and that's the way it should be. Safety is the #1 criteria. You know, there's a lot of things that are worse than noise, and I'll leave it at that. So I'm not being a voting member, Lisa, thank you for giving me a voice and to making comments. I would like to remind all of the voting members to please don't make a decision based on the pictorials that show where the flight the departure vectors are. We know where the arrival patterns are. They're in line with the runways. That's not going to change. They have to be that way. The departures the depiction of the departures, the green shaded area, should not be taken as gospel. The planes do not have to stay in that area. So to the chairman's point of not being parochial on this, it's a very important part. The planes are going to be where the planes need to be, not where the depictions show that we think they're going to be there. So when you do make your vote, make it a vote that affects everyone around the airport, not just your particular vector or suburb heading or what. We're all in this soup together. Let's try to do something that it benefits us all. And then my final point is the thing that would make it better for everybody is for the airport to try to manage the flights at the beginning and end of the fly quiet program start, 11 and 7 o'clock. If we can get the flights closer to that time, then we will all benefit, not just the city, not just the suburbs, we'll all benefit. And thank you very much, Joe, for the work you've been doing here. I know sometimes it doesn't sound like I appreciate it, but I really do. And I would like to see a solution that benefits everyone equally. And that the only solution then is to try to eliminate some of the nighttime flights. It'll go a long way. It'll help everybody. Thank you. And thank you, members of the committee, for tolerating us.
Michael.
Yes, thank you. This is Trustee Michael Gata from Hoffman Estates. And I was impressed with this is the first meeting that I've attended, and impressed with the conversations and the presentation done by Ryan. Is there any possible way that I could get a hard copy of the presentation that Ryan presented? And yes, I understand as far as what he was saying and so forth, being a pilot, I agree with so much of the things that he was saying. But anyways, if that would be possible, I would really appreciate it. And again, thank you. And I'm looking forward to being on this committee. That's all I have, sir. Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, Ernie, and then we've got two people from the audience that want to speak. Ernie?
Thank you, Joe. Just on a couple of things, since we're going through this discussion, and obviously we've probably, Joe, gone beyond your goal, which is to try to get through this as quickly as possible, because I will agree with you. After an hour and a half, it's confusing to the point for myself.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. What'd you say?
I said we have 2 minutes left. Hurry up.
All right. Just really in these configurations, just two questions. One, are we still given any consideration to what happens with any type of intersection departures, especially on the parallels north airfield? And then the second thing is, I know this has come up from some constituents, not necessarily members, but how does OR 21 construction, specifically satellite terminals, play into this? As we look down the road, if we build that satellite terminal further and further west of the current terminals, as has been shown on renderings, how would that impact Fly Quiet? Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Jacob Hill.
Thank you for giving me the time to comment. As a resident of Elmhurst, I appreciate all the information that I've seen here and the chair's comments as to an equitable solution for everybody. I guess the only question I had, and I still am digesting all this information and reporting, and it's great. The only question I had was with the division of parallel versus diagonal runways. It looks like inclement weather, as in the report indicated, 15% of the time, inclement weather affected operations. And would inclement weather mean that diagonal runways would be used even more than is indicated in the two alternatives? So just thought of that as a factor that I had questions and wanted to make a comment about that. Thank you for all your work.
Thank you, Jacob. Suzanne.
Hi all. Hi all. Again, good report, and people seem like they're all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed today. Just wanted to comment on page 4, Ryan, of the report. It had listed 27% of the time the designated runways were not utilized due to operational requirements. I've asked this before, but I have to imagine that there's an ongoing operational schedule to manage the airfield and keep the airport running. And I'm wondering, has the schedule for ongoing regular airfield requirements been included in these configuration discussions? And if they really haven't, wouldn't it make sense to, when the final configurations are decided, that you coordinate with the airfield and maybe overlay operation schedules against the preferred configurations to see if this might affect choices? Because I can't help but think coordination with the airfield might definitely improve Fly Quiet adherence.
Okay, Suzanne, thank you. If there isn't any other statements, do I hear a motion to adjourn the meeting?
I'll move so, and happy Earth Day.
Second.
I'll second.
All right, Karen, I wish you the best.
Thanks, Joe.
Can I hear a roll?
Yes, Bensenville,
Yes.
City of Chicago 39th Ward,
Yes.
Des Plaines, Elmhurst, Harwood Heights,
Yes.
Niles,
Yes.
Park Ridge,
Yes.
River Grove,
Yes.
Schaumburg,
Yes.
Schiller Park,
Yes.
and Wooddale.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right, I guess that's it. Adjourning the meeting. See
Thank you,
everybody.
everyone.
Bye-bye.